It's my distinct pleasure to introduce a man that I have a pleasure to work with on a daily basis here at HHS, and his name is Dr. Don Wright. He is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health as well as the Director of the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. It's, again, a real honor to work with him on a daily basis as part of the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health, and he has graciously agreed to provide us with an update on where things stand with the dietary guidelines for Americans. So, Don?
Well, thank you, Shelley, for that introduction. Let me say it's a pleasure being here today. The work of this group is aligned so nicely with my office and what we do. If you look at the mission of the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, it aligns with the President's Council almost perfectly. Along that line, Shelley's staff and my staff work very closely together. They collaborate on so many issues. We often say that the wall between our offices is very, very thin. Shelley asked me to spend about 5 minutes and share with you the dietary guidelines for Americans as it relates to 2015, where we are in the process, and what you can see in the upcoming weeks and months. As background, I think most of you have heard of the dietary guidelines for Americans. They've been around since 1980. And they provide nutritional guidance for Americans aged 2 and older. Let me say that the Data Quality Act required that these guidelines be based on the highest level of evidence, and I think for good reason. If you look at the dietary guidelines, the impact is huge. All federal nutrition programs and policies must use the dietary guidelines as their foundation. And so the impact of these are large indeed, be it a WIC program for young children, all the way up to the senior citizen feeding programs as well. Next slide. I also wanted to mention that the audience for those is really the professional. They're not written for the consumer. Certainly we have some companion pieces that are appropriate for the consumer, but they are written for the professional audience. Historically, if you look back, our guidelines have come out every 5 years since 1980. And let me assure you that will happen in the future. Congress ensured that that would happen. In 1990, they passed this statute you see on the slide that required HHS and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to publish dietary guidelines every 5 years. Both organizations, both departments work collaboratively on these guidelines, but the primary leadership role alternates between the two, and I will tell you for 2015, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has the lead for that particular project. Next slide. I thought I'd take you on a quick tour of how we arrive at the guidelines. If you look on the left side of the slide, we start with a charter. A charter is created, and then council members or committee members are actually chosen. Currently, we're in phase 2. And this is where the committee meets a number of times and reviews the evidence and ultimately produces their recommendations that are presented to the Secretary of HHS, Secretary Burwell, as well as Secretary Vilsack from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Following phase 2, we move into phase 3, which is where the federal family, both USDA and HHS, take these recommendations and turn them into a policy document. And that takes approximately a year. Perhaps the most important phase is actually phase 4, where we take the policy document and we work on implementation, both within the federal family and implementing federal programs, but also disseminating that among our external stakeholders that have similar interest in improving the American diet. Next slide. So how do we come up with these guidelines? We have a Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. It's a group of volunteers, much like yourself. Let me tell you, these are very busy individuals with impressive resumes that give of their time and their expertise really to improve the health of the nation through nutritional guidance. And I have to commend them, and I do every time I meet with them, but I also commend you for what you do. You bring a great deal of talent to the federal government and really to the American people, and that's what this group actually does. Next slide. You can see the members that we have on our Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee on this slide. The chair of that committee is Barbara Millen for Millennium Prevention, and the vice chair is Dr. Alice Lichtenstein from Tufts University. But we have covered the breadth of nutritional recommendations in the members of our committee that we have, and they're all listed on this particular slide. Next slide. I wanted to show you a little bit of the structure of the committee and how we actually get our work done, where the heavy lifting actually occurs. Let me say that there is a scientific review subcommittee that talks about the scientific review and the process, the very intricate process that we look at the evidence base from which the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee makes a recommendation. There are actually 5 subcommittees. You can see them on this particular slide. And I really draw your attention to Subcommittee 3 and Subcommittee 4 because I think it aligns most closely with some of the interests that those of you on the council might have. In Subcommittee 3, they're looking at diet and physical activity behavior change. And how do we take these nutritional recommendations and these physical activity recommendations and translate them into changed behavior at the local level? And that's what this committee is actually looking at, and the recommendations of that committee will be reflected in the report. Subcommittee 4 also is a very important subcommittee. They're looking at food and physical activity environments and how can we create environments that promote healthy food choices as well as increased physical activity. They're looking at that from a number of standpoints, certainly within the school system setting, within the preschool setting, but also in the work site area as well. So those 2 committees really have a function that I think is aligns with many of your interests. Next slide. I wanted to say just a word about the very intricate process of how the advisory committee comes out with their final recommendations, and those will be coming very shortly. First of all, they have to reflect the highest level of science. First and foremost, there is a very comprehensive literature review that's done. It's actually done by the USDA Nutrition Evidence-Based Library. It provides the members of our committee with the most recent science as it relates to nutritional intake. But in addition to that, the committee will look at some of the systematic reports that have come out. They will, without question, look at some of the work out of the Institute of Medicine that has looked at nutritional information and recommendations that they have made. They'll also look at food pattern modeling and do some modeling. What would happen if Americans change their diet in one way or another, and how would that affect the overall food patterning? And then the last thing, they look at data. What is it that Americans are eating today? They use the NHANES study and others to get an idea of what the average American is currently eating and how that might be reflected in deficiencies of certain macro or micronutrients. Next slide. I thought I'd take you through just a quick timetable of where we are in this process. We began with our actual initial meeting in the summer of 2013. June of 2013 was actually our first meeting. We now have completed 4 meetings, and I'm here to tell you that simultaneous with you opening your meeting today, the 5th meeting of the Dietary Guidelines for Americans meeting opened at the National Institute of Health, and shortly after this meeting I'll be heading over there for that particular meeting. Next slide. So this will be the 5th meeting that will complete by close of business on Wednesday. There will be one final meeting of the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in late November or early December. And then based on those 6 meetings and the deliberations that the committee has had, they will come out with their recommendation for Secretary Burwell and Secretary Vilsack, and they will release that information by the end of the calendar year. That gives the federal family, my staff, the USDA staff, an opportunity to transform or translate the recommendations from the committee into federal policy that then will be implemented moving forward. Can you take the last slide? I know there's a great deal of expertise in the room, both from the council members, but many of those that are listening today in the area of nutrition. And I wanted to make a point that you too can have an impact on the dietary guidelines that will be issued. First of all, we believe good government involves transparency, and this is a totally transparent process. All our meetings are open to the public. They're webcast across the nation, and now that we're doing them by webcast, we get participation from East Coast to West Coast, North to South, and even some from Europe and other countries as well. So it's a completely open process. But let me also say we encourage public comment, and individuals can make comments on the dietary guidelines, and I assure you that the committee members do look at those comments and take them into their deliberation. So you can do that up to the time that the report is actually issued to the secretary. Let me also say, in the interest of transparency, once the recommendations are out, the National Evidence Library will post really the evidence reviews that were done. What is it that the committee looked at and based their recommendations on? It's a very strenuous process. It has to be based on the highest level of science. And as you know, science evolves, and that's one of the reasons that this is updated every 5 years so that the guidelines can always reflect the most current science that we have. I wish I could tell you more, but at this point, the process is very deliberative. The committee has not made any final recommendations at this point, but they will be coming out at the end of this calendar year, and you can see what the new nutritional guidelines recommendations will be, and then that will be followed by the policy document a year later. So Dominique, thank you so much for your leadership, and Shelley, you as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Wright.